Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar hosted by the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, or TIMEP, Social Protections for All in Lebanon, not if, but when. My name is May Saadani, and I'm the Managing Director of TIMEP. Today, Lebanon is facing an unprecedented socioeconomic collapse, plunging millions into poverty. The multiple crises plaguing the country have also laid bare the very weak and fragmented social protection system in the country. Today, we tackle an issue at the heart of all of this, and our panelists put forward an alternate vision for the future. A reminder that today's conversation is being recorded, and if you're on Zoom, you can share questions via the Q&A function. If you're following us on social media, feel free to live tweet or send questions using the hashtag #TIMEPevents. It's my pleasure now to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, Karim Merhej, who is a non-resident fellow at TIMEP, focusing on corruption, socioeconomic inequality, and governance in both Lebanon and Jordan. He's also a researcher and writer at the Lebanese independent outlet, The Public Source. Karim, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, May, for the very kind introduction, and thank you to all our attendees for joining us, especially those in Lebanon at a time when most of us barely have any electricity or our internet connection is really unstable. I think I echo what May just said concerning the situation in Lebanon at a time when the political economic system that has been in place since the end of the civil war has virtually collapsed, a collapse brought forth by the ruling elites in Lebanon, be it the political class or their allies in the banking sector or even their cronies in the private sector. This collapse has really laid bare the fragility of the social protection system existing in Lebanon. And add to that the pandemic, which has led to thousands of deaths that could have been avoidable. Really, it has become the fragile foundations of social protections in Lebanon have been fully laid bare. And today in our discussion, we're going to be, first of all, presenting what the system is in Lebanon for social protections. And after that, we will be discussing what alternatives exist. And I'm really proud to introduce three brilliant panelists who will be joining us today. First off is Dr. Marie-Noelle AbiYaghi, the director of Lebanon Support, which is a multidisciplinary hub based in Beirut for both research and activism and civil society activism. And she is also a lecturer at the St. Joseph University. We are also joined by Adib Nehmeh, a senior policy advisor at the Arab NGO Network for Development. Adib has written many different studies across the years on poverty and socioeconomic development in Lebanon and the region. And we're also joined by Nabil Abdo, senior policy advisor at Oxfam, who's written a lot about social protections in Lebanon. I know how difficult the situation is in Lebanon, so I really thank our three guests for making the time for this webinar, for this conversation, this very timely conversation. And without further ado, let me jump to the first question addressed to Marie-Noelle. Marie-Noelle, could you tell us a bit about the institutions that do provide social protections in Lebanon? What's the system like, and what are the, if you want, deficiencies within it, the fragilities in it?
Okay, thank you, Karim, for the kind introduction and for the invitation to this. I mean, it has been timely for a while, these topics. In order to properly answer your question, it is important, I think, to reiterate and to locate social protection and social protection institutions within a broader social policy perspective. They do not come in, social protection does not come in a vacuum. Social protection institutions are part of social policy making. They are political programs, political decisions that entail more than a system of services or service delivery. They also primarily refer to rights and to processes or how these services are delivered, what kind of services are delivered, whether we're talking about social security, social safety nets, health services, housing, education, etc., by whom these services are provided, and who has an allocation, a say in the allocation of these services, and to whom they are offered, let's say. So social policy is a political process and an agreement that reflects the social rights of the citizens and the residents. Hence, social protection is a political question a priori. Beyond this, social protection is also a concept that is quite politically charged and contested, discursively and in praxis. And it stems from the international development aid cooperation arena and is structurally linked internationally to North-South relations and colonial and aid dynamics. But without digressing, but we could come back to that later on, let's try to use like a working definition for social protection. And as we have agreed, within a broader social policy or public action framework. Social protection, let's agree that it describes initiatives that provide income or, and I'm quoting authors, income or consumption transfers to the poor, protects the vulnerable against livelihood risks, and enhance the social status and rights of the marginalized, with the overall objective of reducing the economic and social vulnerability of the poor, vulnerable, and marginalized groups. And at its core, social protection is a form of redistribution of wealth and income. It is usually and ideally typically provided by the state and theoretically conceived as part of a state-citizen contract in which states and citizens have rights and responsibility towards each other. In Lebanon, we have what we identify as a residual social policy regime that lacks a cohesive, comprehensive vision, to quote Rana Jawad, that is characterized by a reliance on non-contributory social assistance, notably by non-state actors, and that is heavily donor-led policymaking, with up to more than 2/3, and I think maybe Karim and Nabil might correct me on the numbers, more than 2/3 of the workers in the informal sector. So it is very reactive social policy that is mainly led by the international donors and is primarily geared towards poverty alleviation. There is an agreement, a consensus to say that Fuad Shahab, General Fuad Shahab, was the initiator of developmental policies in Lebanon, and more specifically the Lebanese social protection system. And what we have is a Bismarckian social protection, or a Bismarckian inspired social protection system that is typically very fragmented into various funds, with the largest being the National Social Security Fund, the NSSF, that was created in '63. The services that are provided by the NSSF are quite limited to, for example, health insurance, some family allowances, and end-of-service indemnities. Unemployment insurance, as well as disability insurance or work accidents, are excluded from the NSSF, even though they are catered to and stipulated to in the law, in the NSSF law. The fund restricts coverage of its services to workers that are formally employed in the private sector and who represent, I think now, I don't know, maybe a third after the crisis of the Lebanese labor force. So in addition to the limited coverage, the NSSF suffers from structural weaknesses, limiting its capability to provide appropriate care mainly for the elderly, as it does not provide proper retirement and pension schemes. There are two separate funds for civil servants, the Cooperative of Civil Servants, established in '63, that offers more generous benefits to its members compared to the NSSF. The military also enjoy their own cooperatives and pension schemes. And in addition to these national funds, we have many private social protection schemes that are either established by orders or syndicates. And these mainly focus on health benefits and pensions. Of course, private insurance company offer mainly also health, I think, coverage and plans, and prices of these increase proportionally to the services that are offered. And today with the crisis, neither the NSSF, I mean the national funds coverage, or nor the private insurances are hardly covering the insured. Sorry. And at last, but not least, we have this plethora of associative and charity initiatives that do offer social protection to the most vulnerable populations. These, I mean, the associative sector goes back far way back in Lebanon. We have a really rooted, I mean, a long history of associations in Lebanon, but it is also acknowledged that it is, they have development organizations have flourished also during the Shihadist era, with notably a big part of them being subsidized through what has become today the Ministry of Social Affairs. And post-war Lebanon saw the prevalence of association or partisan-run social services, consecrating a very charitable business model based on mainly primary affiliations and clientelistic logics. So in a nutshell, the contributory social protection system in Lebanon is directly dependent on access to the formal labor market, and typically ends with retirement. So when a person needs it the most. Oh, okay. And as in other restricted Bismarckian systems, coverage hardly reaches a portion of the population. While technically all formal employers are required to register their employees in the NSSF, for example, they typically evade it. And as a result, I think three-thirds of the workforce does not have any access to any social safety net. With the most vulnerable populations, such as the elderly, the disabled, the unemployed, and large segments of the most vulnerable groups of workers, such as foreign workers, informal workers, agricultural workers, domestic workers, completely left out. So it is it's up to the private sector, to the individuals, to the families, to organizations, non-profit organizations, charities, to bear the bulk of these expenses, which contributes to directly feed into patronage and clientelistic and sectarian practices. So to recap, we have a reactive crisis management approach to social policy and social protection that is typically articulated towards warfare and crisis and not based on solidarity or redistribution, with an emphasis on targeted social assistance, such as the debates that we are witnessing now. And what is really needed is a cohesive long-term vision of social policy and social protection that would be based on a universal life cycle and social justice approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie-Noelle, for this really succinct overview of the social protection system in Lebanon, and also for emphasizing the point that social protections don't come out of nowhere, and they're based off of social policies. It's the people in power who decide what kind of system we can have. And we're going to get back to universal social protections in the second half of the webinar. But for now, let me move on to Adib. I want to talk a bit about a book you wrote, I think, back in 2014, called The Neo-Patrimonial State and the Arab Spring, where you talk about a form of regime in the Arab world, which you define as the neo-patrimonial state, which is essentially when you have a hereditary ruler or hereditary rulers who basically use public funds and state resources as their personal purse. Could you explain to us more how such a regime in Lebanon, what are the implications of a neo-patrimonial state in Lebanon on the system of social protections, building on what Marie-Noelle just told us?
Yes, thank you, Karim, and thanks for TIMEP for this opportunity. Allow me first just to mention a couple of statistics that are related to poverty mainly, and that includes some comments on what you wrote in the concept note. I think because it is important. Why I am saying that? Because now everyone is referring to what is published by international institutions that says we have 50%, 55%, 70%, I don't know. We have two kinds of critiques to this published figure. The first critique is sometimes it is based on some limited survey in terms of the number of observation that it is, so that it is not really representative, and it may be a little bit more qualitative than quantitative. And this is, for example, the case of the UNICEF survey that you mentioned and some other surveys. And they just call on the phone or to a follow-up for 1,000, 2,000, and then they extrapolate and generalize the results. And the second is of different type, and which refers to the ESQA labor, which they are trying to measure poverty now, including the World Bank, based on money metric measurements in dollars. So they give you a figure. So, for example, the figure of ESQA and even the World Bank, but the latest one, because you mentioned the ESQA one, they say that there is around maybe 65 or 70% of the population that is poor according to the poverty line, and they have a lower poverty line of $8.5 and per day per capita, and another of 14 point something dollars for the upper poverty line. But you know, this dollar can first of all, monetary, measuring this by dollars and by money is not applicable in the case where there is this kind of instability in the exchange rate. So it does not mean maybe the second day, it doesn't mean anything. Secondly, for example, in the case of this report of ESQA, actually, they are using the international poverty according to the purchasing power parity. So actually $1 is equivalent to almost 666 lira, which does not mean anything. However, about the figures, I believe that the figures, they are true, because if you refer to the survey published by Central Administration of Statistics about the income of the household in early 2019, which you can refer, and we just do the calculation according to the current price of exchange rate, we know that 73% of the population of the household, 73%, they earn less than 2.4 million lira per month, which is the equivalent of $126. So according to my view and based on other estimations and previous studies, this is the 3/3 of population that they need assistance. And so actually we are not talking about a small portion of the population and so on. So it is 3/4 of the population that actually need assistance now, which is something, not just social protection, they need assistance. And another point, because of the crisis, and another point is there is some differentiation. I mean, that we have two different processes. One is you get poverty is spread to touch a larger group population, and people who are poor are getting poorer. So there's deeper poverty now. This is what you may consider as being qualitative aspect of process. But for the middle class, for example, we have something different. We have a radical and dramatic change in the way they live. So there is not only a quantitative change, this is a complete transformation of their way of life. They cannot now anymore afford a car, they cannot afford their mode of life, some leisure, they cannot afford having a car, they can't afford putting their children in private schools and universities. So we have these two processes, and that leads to a total transformation of the social morphology. So it is the class composition of the country that is changing. It is not just a quantitative issue that you can just upgrade a project here or something and using the same tools as they were explained by Marie-Noelle. So this is, I think, important, and I will get to this maybe in the second question. But to go to your question directly, Max Weber used the concept of patrimonial states versus the modern state, the civil modern state, which is our modern state, of course. Neo-patrimonial is referring to the same thing, actually. And I used it because it is important to say what I used in Arabic as translation to the word neo-patrimonial was الدولة الغنائمية. Ghanima, the term ghanima, it means spoil. And it refers to when a tribe go to war against another tribe, and then the winner, they just take the people and they take all the assets and belongings as being their own spoils. So it is an exaggerated case of accaparation by force of what was the house. And actually, even when you use the classic terminology of patrimonial versus modern, even within the patrimonial, Max Weber distinguished between what is patrimonial, so it is the traditional hierarchy and the monarchy and so on, and between what he called the sultanic regime, where the force, not the monarchy and the blood, that is the source of the authority. And in our region also, we can a little bit distinguish between what is a dictator, but when this dictator has an oriental, between brackets, flavor, so it is a despot, mustabid, more than it is a dictator. The dictator is a little maybe modern, but the despot is a very traditional, old-fashioned and flagrant dictator, actually. So I'm saying that because this is what is happening now in the Arab region. This is the type of regimes and political system that we have, and this is the type of also ideology and relationship within the state. And we don't have what we may call a relatively independent state apparatus, because the state apparatus, every state apparatus, it has a political function, but it has also an administrative function. And there is a distinction. So usually you change the power, there is another political party that comes, but the administrative part of the function of the state apparatus, they continue. In our region and in Lebanon specifically, it is essentially the political function of the state apparatus, of the administration, of the institution that is. So it is way beyond the simple label of corruption. It is way beyond also the simple notion of clientelism or cronyism of state. It is beyond that. What are the implications? If we are talking politically actually for years now, not now actually, for years, and especially after 2007, after Doha Agreement, we don't have a government in Lebanon. Doesn't mean that it doesn't exist physically. Yes, we have a prime minister and you have ministers and so on, but it is not a government. It is a mechanical addition of ministers where everyone has his own policy, and he is a representative of another political power that is outside the government. So the government don't have authority. The authority is outside the institution, including the government. And there is no unity that is called government with a specific policy. So there is no government policy. The policy of X ministry is related to what this political faction of this policy. And this is continuing now and becoming more and more flagrant. So this is an important point. And this also is what characterized, and we can, using the same perspective, differentiate between what was happening. We used to have a traditional patrimonial state since 1943 after the Civil War. And we used to call it our regime as the form, compared to a form, Dawla al-Mazra'a. Then with Mr. Hariri, the father, he tried to do it a company, So dawli sharika, state-owned. But actually what we end with now is a dawla al-ghanaimiyya, a spoiled, where everyone is trying to do. So even the social protection system that was closer to a traditional clientelism of association and organization with Ministry of Social Affairs and so on, now we are going into a purely spoiled system where what they are doing now is not actually a distribution. They are stealing money. They are taking money by force and resources from inside and outside, like the loan of the World Bank or like the SDR from IMF now. They are taking them, keeping the major part for their own political, and they will be distributing a small part to another section of the population to keep their loyalty and to use it for election. So this is also something, an exaggerated and extreme case of neo-patrimonial social protection system, if I may say. It's not social protection, actually. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adib, for this really brilliant introduction to the concept of neo-patrimonialism or the neo-patrimonial state. I'm going to share Adib's book in the chat so that all the audience can have access to it. It's available online. And with this being said, let me move to Nabil. So Adib mentioned a bit about how since Rafiq Hariri came to power in the early 1990s, and we transitioned into this dawla al-ghanaimiyya, the neo-patrimonial state. Could you explain to us how is this the political economy of the post-war Lebanon that has imploded over the last 2 years? How has this political economy been structured, and how has, can you build on what Adib said and show us more how the social protection system within this political economy were, so fragmented and so deliberately made non-universal, if that makes sense?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. So, yeah, so I think in order to understand the post-war political economy, I think we need to understand also how things ended with the war. And I think the post-war political economy was consolidated around 4 main axes. So one, there was the stabilization of power relations between capital and labor through inflation and devaluation of currency. So we were at the back of 2 major devaluation of the currency through a speculation against the Lebanese lira in '87 and just before Hariri arrived in the beginning of the '90s. So this was this was a sort of a blow to labor through devaluating wages and decreasing the purchasing power and a transfer of wealth to the most powerful. And then we had this new power sharing formula where we have this alliance between economic and financial elites, and also with the ex-militia leaders and the traditional leaders that were there. So we had this kind of power sharing formula. And that's why also I'm a bit uncomfortable with talking about the political class, since the class, it's not necessarily political, but because we have this increasing marriage between where you have bankers going into politics, and we have this kind of intertwining between those who have, these political parties in power, but also economic and financial elites. So they constitute sort of one class. And then we have the consolidation of this merchant economy through, inflating the banking sector and financial sectors and giving primacy to rentier activities. And this also led to the accumulation of wealth outside the sphere of production, in the sense that wealth is not accumulated through production, but more through rent, like real estate, monopolies, banks, etc. And I think at the core of this political economy, in order to understand more, lies the issue of fiscal policy and precisely taxation. Because, to understand the country's political economy, it's really important to look at tax structure as well, because it tells us who is losing and who is benefiting and what are the underlying power dynamics that are interplay. And because taxes are exclusively, are the domain of the political, it's a central government. So it is a manifestation of the political economy and power relations. And through this kind of taxation or the tax structure, we know which sectors are unwanted and which sectors are wanted, what kind of activities are penalized, who are the people who are penalized, and who is rewarded, right? So when we had the post-war, in the post-war period, we had this significant tax reforms, and mainly regressive tax reform, because also we were in this like neoliberal understanding of how economy works, is that we need to decrease costs, decrease taxes in order to attract foreign direct investment. And this clearly did not work and does not work this way. For example, we had progressive corporate income tax that was eliminated and replaced by a flat rate that was first 10%, then it was increased to 17%, to 15, then 17. And also we had taxes removed on income from interest, from like money in the bank. We had import tariffs that were slashed. For example, it was reduced to between 0 and 5%, one of the lowest in the region, and we didn't even enter into the WTO. So we have the fiscal system that was reformed in order to rely on indirect taxation like VAT, consumption tax, etc. All of that. But the main important thing is that the system is biased towards rentier-based activities. So for example, interest from euro bonds were exempted from tax, interest in bank accounts as well, and they were introduced later on. And you have the capital gains tax on real estate that was introduced only in 2017, and it was really very flawed. So when we have this fiscal system that does not really generate enough revenues in order to be able to have this social infrastructure and social investment. And we were in the post-war reconstruction, so the country needed to finance its reconstruction and the state to finance activities. And since fiscal revenues were really meager because of this highly unjust tax system, so we had the debt that grew. I mean, to talk more in simple terms. So that grew, and also because we know. I mean, I won't repeat the story about the banks and debt and how debt, like the national debt or sovereign debt in Lebanon, was a sort of scheme to subsidize bank profit. So we had the public debt that soared in a really impressive way, which, like I said, benefited massive. For example, the bank's profit increased from $63 million in 1993 to $2 billion in 2018. So that represents like 3,000% increase. So when we had this public debt with no progressive tax policies, no enough revenues from taxes, we were at a situation, for example, where between 1994 and 2010, the debt service represented 97% of tax revenues. So in other words, almost the totality of taxpayers' money went to paying creditors, went to banks. So here it's a massive transfer of wealth from the Lebanese, from taxpayers to the bank. So we had the situation where the tax system is telling us specifically that what we want to reward is rentier-based activities, like financial sector, like as a banking sector, real estate, all of that. And we had all this investment or all this capital going to these kind of activities. At the same time, we had the industry that was decimated because of the trade policies and because of this kind of tax system, of this tax infrastructure. And so when we have this kind of destabilization or this kind of rentiering of the economy, if you can say, is that we create informality, we create informal labor. And also, like I said, because wealth is not now through production, through labor, etc., but it is through this kind of lucrative activities of speculations, etc. So informality fuel. And then we have, like Marie-Noelle was saying, that most people now were left out of the formal social security system. So here we had the social security system cannot protect most of the workers in the formal sector. But in the same time, because of this kind of system, we have public services that were underfunded, like health and education, and paying creditors, paying banks, and all the schemes of the central bank that were subsidizing the banks, for example, through real estate, etc. All of that. It means that we were prioritizing that service, rentier profit, over social investment and building universal social protection system, and especially redistribution. And we have the absence of the redistributive mechanisms of that. So and in addition to that, and I think Marie-Noelle touched a bit on it, is that the formal social protection schemes that we have hamper or obstruct the kind of worker solidarity, and also to be able to struggle for universal social protection system. Because of this fragmentation, where we have this kind of pyramid of benefits in the social protection programs or landscape in Lebanon. So we have, for example, like the hierarchy that Marie-Noelle talked about, then it becomes really difficult for workers, for people who benefit from different kinds of schemes and some are more privileged than others, in order to be able to do a sort of collective struggle in order to be able to achieve a better social protection system. So and if we don't see social protection as part of this redistributive economic system, we fail to see, like we fail to really achieve to this kind of system that will protect people. So if you want, in this sense, we had the post-war political economy that really that has produce this kind of landscape in social protection. And just one last word is, maybe I don't know if it's for later on or now, but if we for example, if we talk about how also usually social protection is also approached when we talk, for example, about World Bank, about IMF, and also about the general discourse that is in the country, it is more about a compensation scheme rather than a redistributive scheme. And I think this is really important, because also for all the systems, for example, that Marie-Noelle talked about, like that are not the social security or those who benefit the public sector workers, is that they are based on the compensation. So we had the reforms that were in the country. So we said, let's do the national targeting, the national poverty scheme. So it is about, let's compensate who got hurt. It's not about redistributing. So in the whole discourse about social protection, we tend to also forget those who are in the middle, right? So you have those who are hurt, and those who have the rich, and those who are in the middle, we forget about them, especially that we don't have this kind of developed health and education system and all of that. So maybe I'll stop here, and maybe this is more for later on. Sorry for taking more time.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Nabil, for this really, I think, brilliant overview of the political economy of post-war Lebanon, and this concise explanation of how rentier activities were prioritized or privileged over any form of productive activities in the economy, and mainly by looking at the tax system and how right now in our current collapse that's been going on for 2 years now, we are really bearing the brunt of these catastrophic policies that were taken 2 decades or so ago. With this being said, let me move on to Marie-Noelle, and you briefly alluded to earlier about how now there's a lot of talk about, a cash assistance program, and for quite a while now, these programs like cash assistance targeting the poor have been, advertised as adequate solutions to bring people out of poverty and helping people. And there's a lot of critiques waged against such programs. And now in Lebanon, the government, from what I understand, is about to take yet another loan to establish a kind of cash assistance program for the poor, but there's been a lot of critiques on that. So could you explain to us why cash transfers are not the solution in Lebanon, well, in general, but in Lebanon right now, and also why would we need instead an approach based on universal social protections?
Yes, thank you, Karim. So as we mentioned earlier, narratives, praxis on social protection are entrenched in this international aid cooperation system with a predominance in the narratives and in your question on the concept of poverty and poverty alleviation. And these generally carry what we call a moralization of poverty, through which we other the poor, we fear, judge the poor. The poor are generally depicted as either lazy, not trustworthy, or lacking skills and merits. And this moralization of poverty, in addition to stigmatizing and othering, the poor also carries within it a certain moral obligation to help them. And this can be identified as the rationale behind the charity and aid interventions in general. So basically how we define poverty, how we measure poverty, and the interventions that we design to address it are all highly ideological and political. Again, everything is political. This does not only stem from an approach of policy tourism that oftentimes fails to understand local contexts, social fabrics, and longer-term national policy needs, but also underlines a very static, and I want to say a sociological definition of poverty. As Adib was mentioning earlier, and even Nabil, poverty is not a static condition. Resources rise and fall so as needs and people's ability to meet them. Individual can move in and out of poverty over time. So it may be a temporary situation, a recurrent or a persistent one over a longer term period. So thinking about poverty as fluid and dynamic condition implies a focus on interventions and policies that are process-oriented rather than outcome-oriented. And what we see, for example, in these poverty targeting schemes, cash transfers or so on, is that it's an anecdote, but it's really not funny at all, is that these poverty targeting schemes, it's not even a play on words, expect individuals to actually graduate out of pauperism. So what are subsidies, for example, if we want to define what the two types that we have currently at hand, subsidies and cash transfers. Subsidies are a type of social assistance similar to non-contributory transfers that can be in cash or quasi-cash, such as food vouchers, or in-kind assistance. They consist of mechanisms through which certain goods or services are financially supported by the state, and I suppose in our case by people's own savings, but I mean, we can discuss this a bit later, and sold nationally at lower prices. So subsidies are generally presented by policymakers as a tool to protect against price fluctuations, to alleviate poverty and maintain certain standards of living that notably this missing middle is losing in Lebanon. Subsidies are a regressive form of assistance because their impact on the poorest households and individuals is very difficult to quantify and measure on the one hand. And on the other hand, middle and upper income groups in society tend to benefit from the same schemes, even when they don't necessarily need them, which render them inefficient. As for targeting, and notably what we had within the National Poverty Targeting Program, the NPTP, that was based on proxy means testing, and it's currently discussed upgraded version within the ESSN, or even discussions on the ration cards at the moment, or بطاقة تموينية, I think, or تمويلية. I'm not sure which is the correct version. I'm seeing both circulate. All these interventions are merely piecemeal interventions, handouts, that are thought and implemented in Lebanon as standalone programs, and are not embedded in a wider policy, which hinders their effectiveness and impact. And a lot has been written about on this. They have structural issues regarding how they are designed, who they target, who is identified as their beneficiaries, but also how they are implemented, their financial efficiency and sustainability. But even if you look at the ration cards today discussed, their benefits are so modest that they completely fall short into even addressing symptoms of poverty in Lebanon today. So such types of interventions, whether through the forms of subsidies or cash transfers, are really rooted in very neoliberal definitions and concepts of poverty, and in the very Lebanese sectarian liberal system. But they are also very short-term palliative measures that only mollify the negative effects of structural poverty and a structurally inegalitarian system by simply allowing people to cope with its shortcomings. Globally, cash transfers have been described as the approach to address poverty. But a lot of evidence and research, notably, by scholars and practitioners, has shown that they have not yielded the expected results. We have data from the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, data from Vision 2020 in Rwanda, also from Guatemala, that show that these interventions end up excluding a large portion of the targeted population. And in Lebanon, to which extent can we target more than 3/4 of the population, as Adib has said? How do you target all of this population and this missing middle that is completely forgotten? So targeting schemes and subsidies only address the symptoms of inequality, while leaving untouched the social and economic structures that produce and reproduce them. In this neoliberal agenda, the solution to this flawed definition of poverty is often addressed by the extreme privatization and NGOization and outsourcing of social services, so as not to burden the minimal social state that we have, and encourage people to make it themselves through microcredit loans or cash for work programs, so on and so forth. And in Lebanon, in our sectarian system, where social responsibilities and functions of the state have been outsourced to this array of charities, have been furthering dependency to these zama. And this model, that when it is coupled with poverty targeting schemes through donor agencies or NGOs, has not only contributed to stifle popular discontent and to discipline it for decades, simply by keeping these socioeconomic grievances in check. For how many years have we read that Lebanon was on the brink of the collapse? Always on the brink, always on the crossroads. So today, with all these compounded crises, this approach is no longer viable and acceptable, rather. And we are desperately in need for a systemic change. Today, all funds, including the SDRs of the IMF, should be firstly geared towards a universal social protection scheme. And poverty targeting should be a component of this wider social protection framework and restricted to a smaller group of beneficiaries rather than a standalone program. And I think really, I mean, if the pandemic has allowed us anything, is that by uncovering the failure of these extremely privatized systems everywhere, failing to provide for the people, I think it is crucial today to embark on and reinvent new imaginaries, where we reinvent social contracts, the type of state that we want in Lebanon, and universal social protection is the first step towards this state's creation. And relying on targeting alone only corroborates exclusion, clientelistic practices, and sectarianism, and in turn only corroborates and sustains our inegalitarian system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie-Noelle, for this really good, really nice overview of why cash assistance programs are just all in all not the solutions, and for making us think about thinking outside the box when it comes to social protections. And you know, when it comes to the social protection system in Lebanon, I think you've all mentioned so far how fragmented this not only the system is, but how you have different categories of workers who are more privileged than others, especially how you have some orders or syndicates that have completely different schemes than the one at the National Social Security Fund, for example. So I want to move to Adib right now and think, you know, since October 17, 2019, we've seen a lot of grassroots initiatives to either reclaim syndicates and orders or establish alternative syndicates to the ones that are entirely co-opted by the, let's call it the regime as a whole, as it is. And most recently, we've seen this in the Order of Engineers and Architects elections. And I remember I was watching an interview with Arif Yassin, the new head of the order, who was elected, you know, by being supported by a large group of anti-establishment groups. He mentioned how how the order needs to play a role in bringing forth universal health coverage. So I want to hear your opinion regarding how can reclaiming unions and syndicates be one step towards reaching this universal social protection scheme that Marie-Noelle talked about.
Yes, thank you, Karim. Again, if I may just have a couple of points before also addressing the question. The first, I would like to draw your attention to an article written by Lydia Aswad, I think this year and last year. It has a fascinating title. The title is the political economy in Lebanon, from predator to self-devouring. This is extremely illustrative of our case, and it gives a very straight to the point description of the political economy that go in the same line that was explained by Nabil actually, and it refers only to political aspect, which also I join what Marie-Noelle said, that we don't have in Lebanon now technical answers to the crisis, and we don't have an economic answer to the crisis. This kind of answers do not exist. Actually, what we need is a comprehensive answer, comprehensive reaction strategy, and the entry point is political, actually. This is not because we want this. It is because in this kind of crisis where everything, political, institutional, economic, financial, banking, social, etc., the distance between an immediate intervention and a structural change there is no distance or any time lag between them. Now is the time to do a structural change. Why? What do we do? And as was explaining, Marie-Noelle was explaining. Yes, we already had like 50,000 people covered by the MPTP, the current national, for example, not accounting for the other covered by Ministry of Social Affairs and so on. But let's focus on this because now it is the vogue. Everyone is speaking about it. What does mean that you want to upgrade it from 50,000 to 250,000 households, and then add another 500,000 so that you reach 750,000 households, which is 3/4 of the population, not 3/4 of the poor. Huh? And the document, the project document of the government is misleading. They say that this represents 75% of the poor. This is not true. This is 75% of the population. So when you want to cover 75% of the population, you don't go to targeting. You should go actually to universal social protection plan because it is universal. And if there is some kind of cash assistance that is needed now, as I said also, so it will not be based on proximine test to those eligible to benefit. Actually, you should exclude people that don't benefit and everyone else go and benefit without any criteria. Yeah, and it will be close to the minimum basic income that initiative that is done. When you just exclude a small proportion of the population. And if we are talking about 75% of the population that need support in Lebanon as an average, what would be this in Akkar or in Tripoli or in Rashaya? It will be beyond 95%. So actually it is universal. So what they are doing, and when they say what they want to do, actually they are telling us in the same moment what they don't want to do. They want to give this cash transfer, and that's it. They are not talking about anything else. So actually, they will not do any reform in health insurance or in healthcare. They will not have a public policy for healthcare. They will not have a public policy for education. They will not have public transport. On the contrary, they took the loan of the World Bank for the public transport, and they want to distribute it as cash transfer to the population. While actually we have an extremely dangerous crisis that is causing now social unrest and security problems all over the Lebanon. So you have a solution to solve the mazout benzene crisis, the transport crisis, the security crisis by having public transport that is useful for the poor. You don't want to do it instead of implementing it as fast as possible. So to solve 3 problems, including problem of resources for population, they don't want to do it. They don't want to do any housing policy. They don't want to do any any tax reform. They don't want to do. They don't want to give back the assets and the deposits for people who they have in the banks. So they don't want to do any of this, which are the basic elements of solving our problem. And they want just to distribute money. And they are now having a conflict. Who will control the distribution? And actually now no one 1 year ago, no one wanted to get to be the minister, a faction, none of the political parties wanted to have Minister of Social Affairs as his share in the government. Now everyone wants it because there is the money that's coming. So actually it gives what is ongoing. What is ongoing is that they have now a very massive spoil. They have like $1 billion that is coming from World Bank, from IMF and so on. And they want to use it to just finance their electoral campaign if we will have an election. So I think this is extremely, so it is not what they want to do, tell us what they will not do. They will not try at all to solve the crisis. And actually this is what the title of one of the latest World Bank report that said this is a premeditated regression. And it is done on purpose. It is not because they don't know what to do it actually. And so once we go back to the issue of the union and so on, what happened is that after the war stopped, the civil war in 1990, and we got into the TIMEP era, this, I don't say a ruling class actually, because the class, it means there is something of common interest among these people. I mean, this is a group, a juxtaposition of mafias, of criminals that have the power and the authority to rule everything, the economy, the politics, the media, and everything. And there are the problem now, the additional problem now that may not be also that we may benefit from it. They are quarreling among than others because there is a change in the balance of power between the various factions. What they did after TIMEP immediately during the TIMEP, one of the most strategic and structural issues they addressed was that they want to control the political parties, the General Union for Workers, and the professional association. And they work day by day, on daily basis, every single moment they use it, and they used all the means and the tools they got so that they controlled them, and they were under control. It took like 15 years sometimes, but they controlled everything. So before the crisis, we didn't have actually anything that is not controlled, and they changed the nature of the trade union and the professional association. They should be a counterpower for the government and the political power, and representing population group and their interests and their demands. They turned to be a very efficient tool to control the population and to prevent them from raising their own demands. And sometimes they are used for their internal conflict. That's what happened. Now, I want just to draw the attention that the Bar Association, the change that happened, it happens in when the popular mobilization was extremely high, and that reflects inside the election, so that we got the current Mr. Khalaf as president of the Bar Association. What happens with the engineer is different. It happens in a moment where there was not really, there was a lot of frustration and people were not very much mobilized. There was a very low mobilization in the streets. But the right strategy, the good coalitions that made it, the alliances that made, and the continuous organizational work they did over 2 years, it allowed them to win this election. And the third example in the university, it happens only in private universities. So we have to think about it. What are the dynamics that all these groups are actually either some kind of elite or middle and lower middle class that happens. It didn't happen in the Lebanese university. It didn't happen in the trade union of workers, nor the professors now that public sector or private sector. So I believe that it is not an easy thing to say, and we have a lot of lessons learned how to do relevant strategies, but actually we cannot replicate it mechanically in a public election, in the parliamentary election, nor in the same way in the more popular section, the group of the population. It is more difficult.
Thank you so much, Adib, for this really good distinction of making us think a bit more critically about these different elections that have taken place. Because I've seen a lot of optimism, I would say maybe not very warranted, among a lot of people saying that, okay, now we're ready for the 2022 elections, and we need to bear in mind these very important differences within the different elections that have taken place. And also just regarding the Lebanese university, to my knowledge, I think there hasn't been student elections there for over 10 years now. And this by itself is a crime against the students of that university. And even they're saying now they're gonna cancel the whole school academic year that's coming. Anyway, I'm digressing at this point. Let me move to Nabil here. And I wanted to ask you, Nabil, building on what you were saying earlier about the regressive taxation that happened, that these catastrophic policies, these regressive taxes that were implemented in the post-war era. I want to build on what both Adib and Marie-Noelle said, and to think more about how taxes can be used for, in a progressive manner, to bring forth universal social protections. And I remember in maybe September 2019, I think it was, the IMF released a report saying that the sales tax, which is the most, the TVA, excuse me, which is the most regressive of them all, should be raised to 15, if not 20%. And what kind of alternatives to such austerity measures and such regressive taxations can we think of, and how can these progressive taxes be used for bringing forth universal social protections?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. So, yeah, I think it's important also now that we are talking, or not us maybe, but like in general, but I mean the path towards say structural reforms, all of that, and how to get out of the crisis. I think it's important to keep the political economy lens while we analyze or while we propose pathways. And specifically, I mean to look at it from a lens of inequality rather than just looking at poverty. And so looking at the social protection as a tool for redistribution, I think it's really important as well. So as one of the redistributive elements of our social justice, I think Marie-Noelle mentioned it at first, and I would like to talk more about this. It is that we need, and also building on the point that I was making before, I mean, we need to have this look, especially in how we view society, right? I mean, of course, society, there are different categories of people. But for example, in general, when we see like because much of the social protection schemes, safety nets that are being proposed, and even the ones that like people in Lebanon are also calling for, is also from the approach that society is composed of poor people and non-poor, right? So we need to aid the poor, and the non-poor they're okay. But in fact, I mean, we need to reverse this. We don't need to be simplistic as international financial institutions, but the idea that we have some rich people, right? So the ruling elite class, whatever you want to call it, the oligarchy, and you have everyone else. So I think when we look at it from this way, it means also it begs the question: who should pay for social protection? Who should pay the price of the reform? And this is where redistribution comes from. And taxes are really important in this area because, like I said before, the taxes are an embodiment of power dynamics in society. So I mean that's why we didn't have a tax on income from interest from 1990 till 2003. And when Eurobonds were having like 40% interest, we didn't have tax on that. This is untaxed money. But in the same way, you see like VAT, or IMF wants to increase VAT, increase excise tax, etc., all of that. And in the same way, so looking at it from this perspective is, yeah, I mean, and also what is not unique, but I mean, the situation we have here is because we have such a regressive tax system. It means that there is ample room to make it progressive. right, through a tax on wealth. So, for example, in Oxfam, we did the study like last year, and we found that according to the data that we had in 2019 and 2019, we had those who have wealth of $5 million and above have a cumulative wealth of $74 billion. And this is huge. So you apply like a 5% tax, you will get a lot of money out of it to fund social protection system. And also you'd have the real that capital gains taxes should be better. Increase progressivity to introduce progressivity to corporate income taxes, and all of that. So there is a lot of room to do that. But also, I mean, it's about power dynamics. And I think now, as we keep saying how to get out of the crisis, and much of the approaches and much of what is being said is also about decreasing deficit, about balancing the books, and so it means austerity, right? So also when we think about social protection, we have to think also about having resources to have investment in public infrastructure, social investments, all of that, and that needs resources and that needs spending. So I mean, the idea that also, I mean, I think we need to be really wary of also the discourse regarding balancing the books, and we need to close the deficit and all of that, because what we are heading to is shrinking the public sector a lot, is shrinking the social protection or social schemes in order to have more targets, like Adib and Marie-Noelle were saying. And I would like to comment on something, which is subsidies. Yeah, they are regressive, but I mean, if you think about it, in Lebanon, they were like the only universal measure that was there. So they are regressive, but removing them, the harm of removing them lies more on those who benefit the less, right? So also we need to be aware of this. So I think thinking of social protection in a system where we aim for the distribution, we aim to re-engineer the economy to benefit the most, and for those who own the most, they benefit. They have to contribute to it through taxation. And I think this is the only way, because also when for example you re-engineer the economy through taxation, also you're signaling that yes, we value the social investment, we value productive sectors. And when you say we value social investment, it means we want to build more public hospitals, more transportation, more public education, and all of those from a perspective of universal basic services. Also, this means employment, this means a lot of things. So we don't need to see social protection as only a social tool, but also as a way to re-engineer the economy, because we need all of this in order to fund social protection, to re-engineer the economy to benefit the most. So only if we see it from this kind of holistic perspective, we can reimagine something different. And this is and to end, I mean, of course, this is not a technical solution, and everything that we live and like economic policies are political choices, are ideological choices, and are choices that reflect the interest of the most powerful. So unless we break this kind of power dynamics, and I don't see how we can go there. And but the idea is what kind of interventions, and not only interventions, but things we need to do in order to break this kind of political economy dynamics. And I think this is where the crux of the matter lies. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nabil, for this really interesting conversation about taxation in Lebanon, which is a topic that we don't really think about, generally speaking. It doesn't really come into the mainstream much. So we still have around 10 to 15 minutes maximum, and we have a few questions from the audience, not addressed to any of the speakers in particular. So let me first read the first one. How relevant are comparisons to other countries that went through similar economic developments like Venezuela? Can this generate useful lessons, or does it distort the analytic lens? Does any of the speakers wish to answer this, maybe in 3 minutes or so?
Yeah, I may answer this actually.
Sure.
I think, of course, there are some kind of similarities always, especially in the economic side. So you have inflation, you have the bankrupting of the banks, you have the exchange rate, whatever. But I believe there are also some structural changes, and the comparison may be a little bit simplistic, not only with Venezuela, but with other countries too. In all countries, because even near us, Cyprus, Greece, etc., they all have similar, some way similar economic aspect of that. But we have something that does not exist in the others. In Venezuela, there is one political party who is in power, and where he exercises his powers through the institutions, his government. And the government has the power, and the political party has the power in the government. And it has an ideological choice that is anti-imperialist, anti-American, etc. And they have their own resources. And what happens is the result of many things, of their political choices, of some kind of corruption. But it is mainly about this confrontation with the global market and with the United States of America mainly. In the case of Lebanon, which is completely different from any other people, we don't have a government that has the power and that you can address and you can know this is our policy. Yani, let's say if we need like 5 to 10 years or 15 years to get out of the crisis, but the clock start clicking when there is a government saying, yes, this is us, this is our analysis of the problem, this is what we are going to do, and this is the time frame. In our case, it does not exist. It is not there. And we don't have one power and we don't have one authority. Yes, we have some political faction that is controlling the security and the political aspect. You have another faction that is controlling the institution and making sure that they don't function. Another faction that is still power in the financial and banking sector, and they are all quarreling against each other. So in this sense, what's happening in Lebanon is unique, not mentioning also the internal and the external interference and all the regional and global context. And even when donor countries or other countries intervene to try to solve, actually they are intervening from either their own pure own interest and fighting for their own fights, or actually they are sometimes extremely naive. Like, for example, trying to put everyone together and rebuild a government. And now they are all trying to have an election. We didn't have an election in 2018. It was not an election. It was completely distorted and anti-constitutional. And this was the report, for example, of the Lebanese Association for Democratic Election Monitor. But the Americans and the European Union report said that it is a well-organized and transparent election. And now they are. So no, yeah, it is different. And we need definitely political change as an entry point to a very simple problem like getting the drugs from or getting our gas from stations. Even for this, we will need a political change.
Thank you, Adib, for this really good answer, I think. And yeah, just quick comments about the 2018 elections. I completely agree. Like, the electoral law was presented as if it was proportional representation, but it was monstrosity, I'd say, and no need to dwell on that for now. I think we have time for one more question. So again, addressed to any of the speakers, given that a viable social state never existed and that the oligarchy of cronies, ex-militiamen and bankers have no interest in developing one, how did they exploit social protection funds like the National Social Security Fund or others into their neoliberal framework? Marie-Noelle or Nabil, any of you would like to answer this?
I can try. So maybe one obvious example is using the NSSF funds in order to buy government bonds. So you have the government owns the NSSF. I'm not sure how much, but a lot. So I mean, this is directly in terms of benefiting, if you want, this neoliberal direction. But also, I think the way I was, in a more subtle way, if you want, was how they exploited this in order to fragment solidarities between workers. So, I mean, an obvious example is also, so, you know, because you have like the hierarchy of, so you have the state employees and the army who have most benefits in terms of pension, in terms in terms of also health coverage after they retire and all of that, and also while they work. And then you have the private sector, and also, you know, when you had the mobilization of the general the General Coordination Committee of the Public Sector Workers, they usually excluded contractual workers in the public sector. So contractual workers in the public sector don't benefit from the same scheme. And always the struggle is always about how do we protect the NSSF? How do we protect the benefits of the public sector workers and the army, etc. And in a period where we were at the height of labor mobilization, there were also these kind of propositions saying, for example, to the General Coordination Committee, look, what you can propose is, instead of just going on the salary adjustment and all of that, propose that we have a universal health coverage to everyone through this kind of taxing rents, etc., and in a way, like instead of only having your struggle benefit only, you will actually do to the whole population. And this kind of proposal or proposition wasn't really taken seriously by them. So I think this kind of fragmentation is also a way not only to discipline to struggles, social movements, etc. Because when each of you benefit from something, then you can't struggle for the same thing in a way, and especially when those who have the most, what is their incentive or their benefit as well to struggle with those who have the least. So I think this is one obvious example of that. Yeah.
I totally agree with Nabil. If I could add something, I would say that it's not only the fragmentation of the groups of beneficiary, but it's also the instrumentalization and the cooptation of workers groups. Typically, I mean, historically, groups in power have been entering entrisme and creating yellow labor unions and syndicates, and have systematically tried to co-opt the labor movement more broadly in order to instrumentalize and stifle demands and grievances. But also, I think in Karim Shayib's question, I'd love to answer the second one. And yes, I want to say yes, Karim, because can you read it, Karim?
Yeah, for sure. So our colleague, our friend, actually, Karim Shayib, is also asking, if we had viable universal social security services and safety nets, do you think that the quality of life of thousands of households would have diminished as quickly as they did?
And justement, I think this is the core objective of social protection systems is, of course, and as Nabil said earlier, and we've been, I mean, all of us trying to convey, is that it is social protections systems objectives goes beyond poverty alleviation. It is really about mitigation also of life shocks and typically crises such as the pandemic that and the crisis that we are going through, the compounded crisis that we are going through. So yes, a universal social, and we've seen it in countries that have more universal social protection schemes that have been less affected by notably the pandemic lately.
Thank you so much.
Can I say something on this?
Sure, but very quickly because we'll
wrap up. No, I'm not sure it's a good example, but I think subsidies are a good example of that. I mean, the subsidies here. So, I mean, not that subsidies should remain, but this is a broader political question. But the idea is, so with the collapse of the economy, like now it's been for 2 years now, the subsidies, the subsidies, fuel subsidies, everything like inflated, the price was inflated, but fuel subsidies remained, and the price increased slowly, but it still was bearable for people, and minimum economic activity was underway. And now it's now it's going to be like 300,000, 400,000, whatever it's. But it's not sustainable, of course. But it is a way to show that, I mean, a sort of intervention that can alleviate a sort of crisis. But it's better to talk about the broader and more sustainable, progressive rather than subsidies. But just an illustrative example.
All right, thank you, Nabil. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I think this was a really, really interesting conversation with many different perspectives offered by our 3 brilliant speakers. Before I give it to May to finalize everything, I want to encourage all of our attendees who are interested in learning more about Lebanese politics in general and the topic at hand, and more specifically, to follow our speakers on social media. Follow Lebanon Support on Twitter and all social media outlets. They really publish some great stuff, be it infographics or research papers. Adib just published a book very recently on poverty and in the Arab world by the Center for Arab Unity Studies. I'm going to share the link in the chat so that everyone can check it out. And also, of course, follow Oxfam for the great work they do. I want to thank Adib, Marie-Noelle, and Nabil for joining us and for sharing with us their perspectives. I really think this gave us a lot of food for thought, and this conversation cannot really end. There's always much more to add, but I think we really had some very thoughtful conversations today. May, I'll leave it up for you.
Great. Thank you, Karim, for bringing us this excellent conversation and all of your questions and keeping us on time also. And thank you again, Adib, Marie-Noelle, and Nabil for your insights and expertise. Our webinar today was part of a larger commitment on the part of TIMEP, both to delve into the issue of social protections in Lebanon, and you can expect more work from Karim and my colleagues on this, but also to work more broadly with Lebanese partners, and spotlight really Lebanese expertise on these issues, on issues of corruption, socioeconomic inequality, and accountability through analysis, advocacy, and legal interventions. You can follow TIMEP's work by signing up for our listserv and following us on Twitter and Facebook as well. To our audience, thank you for your questions and your engagement, and to the TIMEP team working behind the scenes to make this event happen, thank you so much. Everyone have a good day, afternoon, evening, irrespective of where you are.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.